Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. The election hasn't been certified at this point, and there are still some relatively close races, but it is clear that Democrats will add to their large majorities in the state House and state Senate. There's a change in leadership at the top. For the first time in 12 years, Washington will have a new governor. And for the first time in 24 years, the state will have a new insurance commissioner. The 2025 legislative session starts in 2 months. What can we expect? And what factors will impact the options available to state leaders? 3 initiatives failed, meaning the state's Climate Commitment Act, capital gains tax, and long-term care program remain intact. But any state or utility-driven policies that could restrict natural gas service would conflict with the state's newest law following the passage of Initiative 2066. Barring a major change in the November 20th revenue forecast, lawmakers will be confronted with difficult funding decisions right out of the gate. On November 8th, the Office of Financial Management reported that the operating budget faces a $10 to $12 billion deficit over the next 4 years, which will impact agencies, services, and projects. Joining me now, Paul Queary, editor of the Washington Observer newsletter, and Laurel Demkovich, state government reporter for the Washington State Standard. Thank you both for your time today. You both cover the policy debates as they unfold, but sometimes also look at things that might be in the works. Laurel, from your perspective, based on the situation that the new legislature will be walking into and based on what we know about the election, anything stand out to you as issues to watch, areas of interest?
Yeah, I think the biggest question I think that lawmakers are going to have to face is what to do about a pretty big hole in their budget for the next 4 years. How they address that kind of remains unclear, I think. I think one of the big things, and at least for Democrats, that was a good thing from the election is none of the initiatives passed, and those would have left, I think, an even bigger hole for them to have to fill. So I think that's kind of one thing that they're not super nervous about, but I do think, trying to figure out whether it's new taxes or cutting programs or other things from the budget, that's kind of going to be a question on day 1 and maybe day 105 as well.
What do you think, Paul?
No, I agree with Laurel. I think a lot of the stuff that the legislature's done in recent years has a really substantial kind of fiscal bow wave. It's going to cost more money in the out years. I think that one of the big things that we might point to is the big expansion of child care and early learning programs, which are scheduled to become an entitlement in the future years, which means they have to pay for them. So I think that, I look at that, at the Democrats in the Senate and House caucuses, and I don't see a lot of votes to cut the budget, and I see a lot of votes, for new taxes and new revenue. And I think, we saw the speaker come out right after the election and sort of plant a flag in the, dead body of the capital gains tax repeal and say we're going forward from here. So, yeah, that's what I expect going forward. And frankly, a lot of the barriers to that we've seen in the past are just not there anymore. I mean, Senator Mullet's gone from the Senate. Senator Vandeweghe's gone. In particular, Senator Mullet's replacement is not, the same type of politician. And I think the structure that we have seen in past years of the Ways and Means Committee as sort of the killing ground of progressive ideas is not going to be as much of a thing. So, yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
Based on just the legislative races themselves, or rather taking a look at sort of how that shaped up, one area which was really a focus of attention is the 14th legislative district, the Yakima Valley area, I believe, is where the races have been, where the newest districts, which were basically redrawn by a judge, so to speak, were drawn in a way to potentially increase Democratic representation there, but Republicans have had leads in those races up to press time today, which is Wednesday. What's your perspective on how that race shaped up, or those races rather?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm sure progressives are trying to figure that out. I mean, they poured a lot of money into some of those races to try to get the Democrats elected, and as you said, at this moment, Republicans seem to be leading in all of those. Although, there's still some votes, I guess, left out there that could change some things. But I think that area also had particularly low turnout, which could have had a huge play in kind of how that ended up. And in general, the state, I think this year had low turnout for a presidential year. So I think that kind of had a huge effect on how some of these races turned out. But, at the end of the day, as Paul had already said, Democrats still hold a majority in both chambers and are, growing slightly, maybe not to the supermajority point yet. But, losing those seats were expensive for some folks, but aren't, a killer in terms of Democrat policies.
What do you think, Paul? How would that affect everything? And are you surprised?
I was a little surprised on election night at the margins, and the margins have tightened pretty dramatically. And so you can definitely, there's some questions about whether the candidates that the Democrats offered in the 14th really kind of matched the district. And I think that might have played out a little bit in the result. Ultimately, if I'm a Democrat sort of looking for a silver lining in this whole thing, I can say, I can point to incremental progress in the 14th and, think about the years ahead. And also, that map not only redrew the 14th, but it also made the 17th and the 18th in Southwest Washington more favorable to Democrats. It's looking like the Democrats are going to take the 18th Senate seat away from the Republicans, and the 17th was pretty competitive. It looks like current Representative Paul Harris is going to hold on there. And also the amount of money that the Republicans had to put in to defend in those three districts is money that they didn't have to spend on the 5th or the 28th or other places where they might have tried to take some Democratic territory. So, I think in the end, the Democrats look to come out with an extra seat in the Senate and an extra seat in the House. Gives them the lesser form of supermajority, which, has some implications, for budget negotiations of various kinds. So, I think they're probably feeling pretty good at this point.
Looking at some of the statewide elected positions, one of the offices we have not had a change in leadership in since the turn of the millennium is the Insurance Commissioner's office. The Insurance Commissioner-elect, Senator turned Insurance Commissioner Patty Kuderer, has a very progressive agenda. She ran on an agenda for gun insurance insurance for gun owners, taking a stab at the hard to insure homes on the peripheral of wildfire areas, that sort of thing. And of course, universal health care has also been a policy that she's supported before. Given her sort of energy behind some of these issues and the state of the majorities in Olympia, do you think much of that might get traction?
I think that, that's kind of a brave new world in that office. I mean, Senator Kuderer's political origin story is a sort of terrifying story about her daughter being born with a condition that required really expensive experimental care, and her fight with insurance companies about, whether they would pay for that. And it's, I think that combined with the fact that she is a plaintiff's attorney by profession means that she is, to describe her as antagonistic to the insurance companies is really just an understatement. And so I think from the insurance industry's perspective, I think that they're nervous. And then from the sort of broader healthcare industry perspective, she has a different vision of a healthcare system than the one that currently exists. And now she has a pretty big soapbox to argue for that.
Laurel, what's your take on some of those very big policy goals, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, the insurance world, I think, is just going to become increasingly more important. As you mentioned, some of the difficult to insure homes like near wildfires, and I think just the environmental and climate aspect of the insurance world is going to be a huge thing that she'll have to deal with, and the legislature will have to deal with in the next 4, 8, 12 years. So I think that will kind of be a huge thing. And as Paul said, the healthcare aspect, I think, remains to be seen, I guess, how much she can get through in the legislature. But as we've already talked about, as we're kind of going further in the progressive direction of the legislature, things like that might become more of a reality. And
the Attorney General-elect Nick Brown had announced key leadership positions for his incoming administration, and some of those are figures we've seen in previous administrations, in the governor's office, for example, and then some are also outgoing director of the State Department of Ecology. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, those had just come out today, so I think it's all kind of new and still trying to kind of see what Nick Brown's vision, I guess, of the office will kind of look like. But as you mentioned, he's bringing in people with a lot of experience. David Postman, who used to be in the governor's office, Laura Watson, formerly of the Department of Ecology, and Noah Purcell, who could have been the Attorney General had Nick Brown maybe not run. And you know, I don't know exactly what his thinking was in some of those. I think with the ecology pick, it's possible that maybe he's anticipating some environmental suits that the state will have to take on in a new Trump administration. That was kind of a huge topic during the previous Trump administration among Ferguson's lawsuits. So that could be, you know, one of the things he's thinking about. But it could just be that he's looking for people who have experience in state government. I don't know.
What do you think?
So I've known David Postman for many, many years, and he's very much a sort of communications forward pick as chief of staff. He was the chief political reporter for the Seattle Times, and he worked for Paul Allen's company Vulcan in Seattle as communications director for them, and then he was Inslee's first communications director before he was chief of staff. And he has a really sophisticated understanding of sort of the communications and media landscape, and I think he was able to deploy that really well on Governor Inslee's behalf, and I would expect him to do that on Attorney General-elect Nick Brown's. Nick Brown, if you looked at the sort of quality of the campaign and the sort of insanely cute kid ads and so on and so forth, you got to figure that Nick Brown has a lot of political upside in the future, and I think they're looking toward that.
So the incumbent superintendent of public instruction, who's heading back to Olympia, or staying in Olympia rather, has put forward a pretty large request for additional funding for education to heap onto the budget picture we've already talked about. A few $1 billion, I think, is what they're asking for. So given the picture given what we know about the budget today, which again could change significantly next week, who knows? What do you think the odds are of that happening, and or do you think that adds pressure to new revenue streams, or what?
Yeah, I think it adds pressure, but when you start arguing for big tax increases or big spending increases, then you start to get around to sort of, is everybody who wants to get paid going to get paid, right? Because they're, the various interest groups are going to, they're not going to want to waste an opportunity. If you have what I kind of anticipate to be sort of a signature year for progressive policy and revenue, you don't want to be left behind, because historically the political fallout of that is pretty, can be pretty severe at the next election, and you might not have another opportunity. So I would expect it to be a lot of pressure. I think there will be a lot of pressure from school districts, from the teachers union, from other education interests to infuse even more money in schools, which has happened significantly in the past few years as it is. And I doubt that those interests will, really allow themselves to be left behind if there's a big revenue package.
Given the success of the bond issues, or lack of success for school bonds in a lot of districts, there was a case that was anticipating, becoming the next McCleary over school construction funding in rural districts. The legislature's position historically has been the Constitution says you got to pass a local match. Do you think that's likely to change with the incoming stronger Democratic majorities? Is that an issue that might see, a comeback next year?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that we saw, especially in the campaign for superintendent of public instruction, is that no one appears to be happy with the state of schools in Washington. I mean, both in terms of results and also just, as you mentioned, funding for schools. Schools are closing, there's construction issues, special ed funding is drastically low in the last few years. So I think that will definitely be top of mind, and trying to figure out how exactly to get districts the money that they need will kind of remain a question. And it could be, like you said, kind of through the bond issue, but yeah, I don't know.
that's that's the supermajority that the Democrats didn't, achieve, which is you need a 2/3 vote in both houses to put a constitutional amendment before the voters, and that would allow, in theory, you could offer a constitutional amendment that would allow those school bond measures to pass with a simple majority. Now they need a supermajority from their local voters, and most of the ones that failed at the last election got the regular majority, but not the supermajority. And the legislature, I think it's been a long time ago now, 20 years or so ago, made a similar change for school levies that allows them to pass with a simple majority, and that sort of took some of the pressure off that. But again, you're going to need some Republican votes there, and that becomes a very tangled issue for the Republicans because many of the most property poor and cash poor school districts where these bonds fail over and over again and the buildings are crumbling are in Republican areas. But folks there are kind of at no on raising their property taxes because it's pretty tough out there in a lot of those places. So exactly how they fix that, and there has been, to your point about the lawsuit on the school buildings, I think it was in the Wahkiakum School District. Yeah. A lot of push to solve that problem in some other way, than try and get local, taxpayers in places where there's not much of a tax base to start with to shoulder the costs of replacing those schools. We'll see.
And also in the last legislative session, the lawmakers dealt extensively with the property tax cap. Again, that issue has come up and been discussed. It's something that local governments, cities, counties have really had their eye on as far as lifting that 1% annual cap, which would also be yet another property-related tax issue for legislators to consider. Do you think we're likely to see that next year, possibly?
I think we'll definitely see it again. I know last year, kind of around the time that it was pretty clear that it was not going to pass or be a reality. The line that we were kind of hearing was, we're just not ready yet. It needs a couple more years. So I think, that could be something, especially as the state and cities and counties are looking for more revenue stream. That could be something that they do. But do they have the votes for it at this moment? I don't know. Again, it was too early last year. Is it too early this year? I'm not sure.
All right, changing tracks from revenue here to policy. What policy areas, pick an area, might get more attention next year with a somewhat stronger Democratic majority in the House and Senate?
So I think you'll see some attention paid to some tweaks to the sort of clean energy suite of policies. Right now, there's there's legislation on the books that sort of envisions that there would be an enormous amount of clean energy generated in the future, and that would displace coal and gas-fired electricity that exists now. That stuff is not getting built apace. Which in theory leads to problems with complying with those laws, and then also in theory leads to problems, maintaining the electrical grid and just getting electricity to people when they need it. And so I think you'll see a lot of policy directed at that, and it's that's a delicate place to be because you're into the realm of kind of environmental protection and the ability of local communities to protest when large facilities are sited within their borders. And so I think if I'm looking for something interesting there. I also think we're likely to see a renewed focus on sort of revamping the recycling system a little bit. We've had bills that on that issue that failed kind of dramatically in the last 2 years.
Bottle deposit.
Yeah, I don't know about that one.
What do you think? Any other policy areas, or what do you think?
Not necessarily a new area, especially in the last few years, but I do think housing is obviously still a huge thing on everyone's mind. I mean, the lack of and the cost of, and so dealing with that is going to continue to be on lawmakers' minds, how they figure out a way to boost supply and just get kind of costs down, and then trying to come up with solutions for the homelessness crisis and getting those folks into homes. I also think rent stabilization will be another big fight this year. That was a huge one last year that kind of went up to the wire, and then it had a whole kind of roller coaster through the system. And so I think that will definitely come up again. And there will be obviously changes in the committee structure. As you mentioned, Patty Cooterer, who is the chair of the Senate Housing Committee, is moving on. So who goes into that position and kind of what that committee looks like will probably play a huge role in the likelihood that we get a rent cap.
On that note, too, the Senate Democratic majority announced the new leader is Jamie Peterson of West Seattle. Yes, Seattle.
Capitol Hill.
Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but he's a veteran legislator, been in the legislature in some form or another for really quite some time, since mid-aughts, I believe. So, and based on what you know about his track record, his positions on various issues, do you think that strengthens the case for new revenue?
Yeah, I think possibly. I mean, I think he's maybe slightly more to the left of Andy Billig, who was the previous majority leader. But I do think, I mean, as you mentioned, he's been in the legislature for quite some time. He kind of knows how things work and knows kind of the compromises that you need to make. So he might have a little bit of a stronger opinion on kind of how or what bills he thinks and what revenue streams he thinks should kind of be pushed forward this year. But yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen, I guess. I mean, he was a great floor leader the last few years. He was very efficient in getting things kind of done and through the Senate. So if he kind of keeps that in the majority leader position, then we could be seeing, a pretty efficient session.
And with under a minute here to close this out, your thoughts on that? Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing about Senator Peterson's kind of ascending to that role is, what you might think of as the kind of the direct focus on the leftward half of the caucus. I mean, that is arguably the most progressive district in Seattle. And on, for example, there was a famous email from Senator Peterson about, the idea of the capital gains tax as a way to attack the constitutional ban on the income tax. So I do think, I mean, it's not, I don't know that there's necessarily that much ideological daylight between Senator Peterson and Senator Billig, but I think the optics of it is that it's now a very solidly progressive caucus.
Well, we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Paul, as always, for your insight. Thank you very much, Laurel, for your insight and perspective as well. We do appreciate it. Still ahead on The Impact, a change of command in the state Senate. The details after the break.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Washington State is not missing high-speed police pursuits. Washington State is missing the possibility of a high-speed pursuit.
There will be a new majority leader in the Senate when lawmakers return to Olympia. On November 10th, the Washington Senate Democratic Caucus selected Senator Jamie Peterson to be the next majority leader. Peterson will take the reins from outgoing Majority Leader Andy Billig of Spokane, who announced his retirement from the legislature earlier this year. Peterson is the former chair of the Senate Law and Justice Committee and has been in the legislature since 2006. The 2025 legislative session begins on January 13th. Outgoing and incoming state executives are gearing up for a possible round 2 of Washington State versus the White House in President Donald Trump's second term. Outgoing Attorney General and Governor-elect Bob Ferguson clashed with the Trump administration dozens of times in court during his first term. In a joint press conference, Governor-elect Ferguson and Attorney General-elect Nick Brown said the agency is again preparing for potential conflicts between state and federal policies under the new administration.
And it's very clear that the AG Ferguson and his team has spent a lot of time thinking about what's next. And we will take those challenges very seriously and be prepared for the work ahead.
Watch The Impact anytime or listen to the podcast on tvw.org. Thank you for watching. We hope you'll join us next week for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. I'm Mike McClanahan. Have a great week.